All right, I'm going to call the select board meeting for Monday, February 12th, 2024, for the town of Essex to order. First item on the agenda, are there any agenda addition or changes from staff?
None from staff.
Any agenda additions or changes from board members?
No.
Okay.
Can't see Kendall though.
Don't hear anything. I hear any. I mean, I don't hear any updates. So let's. There we go. Now we can see people's hands if they put them up. Okay. With no changes, let's move on to public to be heard. Public to be heard is a time when those attending the meeting can speak to the board on topics that are not on the agenda. If you'd like to speak during public to be heard, please either raise your hand in the room or raise your hand online by moving you can move your cursor down to the bottom of your screen in the Zoom application. There's a reactions button. If you click on that, it'll give you the opportunity to raise your hand. Is there anybody who would like to speak during public to be heard?
I do not see any hands in the room, Andy.
Okay, I don't see any hands online either. So let's move on to our first business item, which is presentation and discussion about town meeting preview. So Greg and I actually went through this on town meeting TV a week ago. So this will be my second time going through it, and we'll do it again the evening before voting. So Greg, if you can bring up the presentation. Okay, so this is the same presentation that we will show at our town meeting event. And so before the budget process started, the select board gave staff some goals. There we go. The first was to limit the budget increase to a 5% tax rate increase at the most. Next was we wanted to maintain and improve pedestrian trail network and connectivity in the town. We wanted to increase community outreach and engagement. We wanted to find ways to increase revenue streams, including grants. Also wanted to put additional attention on our capital needs in our capital budget, and then also look ahead to development of our municipal site at 80 and 90 Upper Main Street. Okay, next slide, Greg. Okay, the proposed budget does not cut any services. It maintains all current and existing services. There were several challenges with regard to keeping the tax rate increase below 5%. One of those was that the health insurance and premiums are increasing in the order of 13 to 14%. Inflation has been pretty high of late, as most people probably recognize in their own bills. Supply chain issues have extended the time period for major equipment and vehicles. So that offers some challenge with regard to getting access to vehicles and when we can get them and when we pay for them. In the past number of years, we've budgeted our police patrol officers at 90%. The police department has authorization to fully staff, but because we've been typically short a few positions, we haven't actually spent all of our police budgets. We've been budgeting lower than the full amount. So that's at 90% this year for patrol officers. Dispatch, we used to do the same thing, but now we're fully staffed there, and we're budgeting that at 100%. So we're no longer in this budget won't be reducing the budget there. Things that we're doing for cost savings and efficiencies, we have shared service agreements for the police department and assessing services. The police department is a 10-year agreement, which we're still in the first year of. And assessing services is expected to continue through the end of the current fiscal year. The other thing that we've done to keep to maintain spending is to flat level fund the capital transfers at 470,000. Same as this year. Okay, next slide. Some of the highlights of the budget, we've in the fire department, in order to encourage additional volunteerism and also to be more consistent with what other communities are doing, we're adding stipends for volunteers to be on call for evening and weekend shifts. This also improves our coverage at the fire department. We're increasing the pay rates for per diem firefighters by $1 an hour to better match market rates. And then we're also adding stipends of $40 per evening and weekend shift for our volunteer, for the 4 volunteers per shift. The utilities clerk, we shifted some of their salary to the general fund from the water and sewer fund. Public Works, 2 part-time staff have had their full salaries and benefits moved to water sewer to better reflect the work that they're doing. Police department includes the elimination of the seasonal records clerk. That position has seasonal record clerk and a records clerk / dispatcher becomes solely a records clerk. So instead of having the work there split, there'll be specific individual for that. Stormwater summer interns both can be paid out of the town general fund, and 10% of the GIS coordinator position will be included in the assessing department's budget. This is largely because they're helping out with the reassessment, and that's those costs need to be included in the assessing department, so they're correctly reflected in charges that we send to the city for that work. Okay, next slide. We're using $398,100 from fund balance. Fund balance is money that's left over from prior years, money that we've underspent from prior years. The select board has a fund balance policy to maintain 15% of our budget as undesignated. The rest of it we do designate, or required by that policy to designate for a specific purpose. This year we've allocated $325,000 to offset taxes in FY25. We're also commissioning an economic development report and a first responder study. Those are one-time expenses rather than adding them to the budget. We're using leftover funds from prior years to pay for those. And there's 2 information technology projects that add up to $8,100 that were also coming out of that fund. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the summary of the changes in operations, salaries and including benefits are increasing 468,000. Our insurance is actually going down. This is our workman's comp insurance because we've had a safe year. Salt, sand, gravel, fuel, and gasoline are all up because of inflation. Our professional services have gone up. That's partly, but that's funded. Some of that is funded from fund balance, as I mentioned on the prior slide. Vehicle purchases are up 24,000. Some of that's inflation. Technology subscriptions and licenses are up. Summer construction services, which is largely paving. Again, that's inflation. And the total net of all operating increases are 705,269 over last year's budget. Okay, next slide. So the proposed budget is 16.1 million. Again, that's a change of 705,000, as I detailed in the prior slide. The percentage of the budget change is 4.58%. The amount of of taxes we need to collect increases by 5.03%, using the assumption that the grand list will increase by 0.75%. That results in an estimated tax rate change of 4.24%, which is below the 5% that the select board had asked for. Thank you. No, go ahead. Looking at a typical home that's currently assessed at 280,000. Remember, this is assessed value, not market value. The FY24 tax rate, the current year tax rate is 0.6766. The estimated tax rate for FY25 is 0.7053, which is a 4.24% change, which nets out to $80.36 for as I said, a typical home valued at 280,000. You can use if you can do a proportion, you can put in use your assessed value to directly scale the change, if you'd like to get an assessment for your own change or an estimate. Again, this assumes grand list growth of 0.755% and the use of 398,000 of fund balance. This tax rate does not include the capital tax rate of 3 cents or the local agreement rate, which is typically around 0.2 cents. Okay, next slide. This pie chart shows for that $280,000 home where where all of the funds actually go. General government and police and public works are the biggest chunks, followed by culture and recreation, which is the library and our rec department. After that comes fire, and then capital, and then some smaller pieces after that. Okay, I think that's it. So I think now I'd like to go to questions. Are there any questions? Let's see. Anybody have any questions or comments about the budget? I don't see any hands online.
I don't see any hands in the room.
All right. And are there any comments that board members want to make?
Just for anybody that's watching this after, but we did miss slide number 4 about the library and stuff. But I don't know if we need to read it in.
Is this slide number 4?
A little bit, but we skipped slide 4.
Yeah, he started with the fire department instead of the library one.
Just for the recording.
You want to go back to that, Greg?
Yep, I am going to pull it up.
Yeah, now that you mentioned that, I remember not talking about it. So. Yep. Thank you, Ethan. Yes, staffing changes included in this budget. The library is going to add an additional 15 hours per week to help with coverage. This will help the library stay open more hours and also help balance employee workloads. The library budget also includes funding for an assistant library director so that we have promotional opportunity for existing staff. FY25 budget proposes a part-time administrative assistant to the manager's office and a part-time trails coordinator within the Parks and Recreation Department. The assistant to the manager's office will help with balancing workload of our management staff, and then the trails coordinator will do trails coordination. So those are key adds to the staffing. And again, allocations of personnel costs between the general fund and the enterprise funds have been updated, especially for Parks and Recreation. The enterprise funds are accounts where the department, for example, when they charge fees for programs, those fees directly support the cost of administering those programs. So there are revenues and expenses that flow through the enterprise fund, and the intent there is that to some degree Parks and Rec is self-funding. Another important thing is the senior center coordinator position is no longer needed now that we no longer have a joint effort with the city of Essex Junction around the senior center. We're also reducing senior van drivers from 3 to 2, partly because the city no longer gets service or senior van service. And then with the completion of separation of the near completion of the separation of our finance department from the city's finance department, or their department from ours, however you want to look at it, we no longer need the part-time staffing and consulting that we had been using previously. So, all right. So Greg, let's move to the other presentation. Okay, so this is a discussion of the town meeting ballot items. There are other things on the ballot besides the budget. So go ahead and move to the next slide. Okay, so Article 2 is adoption of the 2024 town plan. Because we have a town plan, are required to update it every 8 years. Town plan is used to paint a picture of the future, help us make Essex a great place, establishes a transparent, predictable public policy, and promotes wise investments and helps future costs. Because we have the town plan is used to implement and update all of our zoning and subdivision regulations. It's a necessary component for many grant opportunities that we are eligible to apply for. It also helps us with adoption of our capital plan because it shows where we're headed, and it also makes clear for all of our municipal departments, boards, and commissions what direction the town is heading in. The town plan needs to be approved by a Australian ballot from town voters. State statute requires one public hearing by the Planning Commission and 2 public hearings by the Select Board. Those happened in November, December, and January. So those were completed. The town plan did have a very large amount of public input. There were subgroups that were pulled together to provide all of the input for it, and so that will be on the ballot. Okay, next. There are also 2 voter-backed petitions. One is asking, these are 2 voter-backed petitions that were submitted ahead of town meeting. What this means is that signatures were collected of at least 5% of the registered voters, and the town clerk certified those as being correctly submitted, and all the signatures were valid. And so the select board is bound to put them on the ballot. So Article 3 asks, shall the voters require the town annual report to list the location and commercial properties that received municipal tax stabilization benefit within the report fiscal year, the amount of that benefit, and property owners. So the town of Essex has tax stabilization agreements with 2 businesses in town. They are put in place typically to encourage job growth and quality and sustainable economic development in the community. And so what this article is asking is whether to include that information in each year's annual report. I will note that it does say advisory at the end of the article question. I'll talk a little bit more about why that is there in a minute. So the next slide. Next slide is, shall the voters require the town annual report to list the names, position titles, salaries, and benefits of all town employees within the annual report fiscal year. And again, it's advisory. All of this information is public information. Anyone can ask for it at any time, and the town staff would happily provide it. But again, this is a petition came in. We're bound to put it on the ballot. The one change that the select board can change the language for clarity and for legal concerns. And so we did add, based on the advice of the Vermont League of Cities and Towns and our town legal counsel, the advisory in parentheses. I think, Greg, you go to the next slide, includes the explanation of this. And so although we're bound to put the questions on the ballot, they are advisory in nature because there's nothing in statute or in our ordinances that requires us to do what we're asked to do. If the vote comes back yes, it's a request to the select board. It's not a mandate. Having said that, though, I'm only saying that because I want to make it clear that it's not that a future select board could choose not to do this. This again the vote isn't a mandate. The only mandate is that we put the question on the ballot. We don't actually have to do what the question asks. Just to make it clear, to be fully transparent, so people aren't surprised at some point if this doesn't happen. Okay, the other questions on the ballot will be, there's an open seat for the moderator, which is a 1-year term, and one select board seat, which is a 3-year term. And I think that's it, right, Greg?
That is it.
Okay, are there any questions or comments?
Do not see any hands in the room.
All right. Do board members want to make any comments on any of that? Did I miss any slides?
Not that time.
Nope.
All right. Okay. Then let's move on to business item B, 5B, presentation and discussion about fire department impact fee phase 1. Greg, who do we have to talk about that?
We have Steve Trenholm from the fire department, assistant chief, and John Slayson from VSD Consulting, who's been working on the study.
And I'm going to immediately turn it over to John and let him get into the good stuff.
And John, let me know if you want me to pull up anything on the screen.
Yeah, well, we'll pull up the presentation slide deck. I believe the board was provided a draft memo or report, as well as a presentation for tonight. So as Steve mentioned, I'm John Slayson with VSD Consulting, and I've been working with the fire department now for a few months as we're exploring what an impact fee would look like for the department. Impact fees are not new to the town, but they would be new for the fire department if we eventually get there. So we wanted to be here today I probably have more than enough slides, but we want to kind of cruise through them and take some questions and make sure we're all comfortable, because at this point in time, we're introducing the concept to the board and to try to get a sense of any questions and concerns you might have, as well as just giving you the roadmap for where we hope to go. So Greg, if you want to pull up that slide deck, that would be great. Yep, this is it. And I'm happy to take any questions en route here. So if there's any questions on impact fees generally and anything I say that's a concern or question, by all means, At this point in time, it's just simply information. There's no action tonight from the board. So we'll go to the probably the slide 4 or so. It's an impact fee concept. There we go. So impact fees, as I mentioned, the town has had impact fees for some time. They generally are set up. They're a land use regulation meant to help mitigate the adverse impacts associated with land use development and growth. And so there's a couple requirements that you have to have. One being growth in itself, that the town has. We know that land use is changing and we're continuing to attract population and employment here in the town. What happens then is that the idea is that as new residents and new jobs are added, we're seeing demand for our services. No doubt, we all acknowledge the cost of, we saw the budget presentation, the cost of delivering these services are also increasing, but also just the demand themselves. So we have some charts later on that will show the impact recently on the fire department and the increase in demand for the various services. The concept of an impact fee is that as new users are added to the system, the experience that others may have could deteriorate. And in the case of the fire department, we're seeing calls answered. Actually, we're not answering all of our calls. And so we're seeing the calls volume increase, and we're not able to satisfy the full demand today. And as we increase the number of residents and land uses that we have in the town, that probability is only likely to increase.
John, if I can just, sorry to stop you, but
No, please.
as far as the calls not answered for service, they were all EMS in nature. We have answered all fire calls. So I just wanted to make sure that we clarified that.
Yeah, thank you. That's important to note. And so the solution that's typically at hand is to add more capacity to the system. And so in the case of the fire department, this means new apparatus, new vehicles. It could be equipment for additional staff. It could be a new station. So it can take a number of different flavors as we increase the ability to meet future demands. So next slide, please. This is a legal requirement from the state statute that I think from the mid-'80s it was placed into action. So I won't read this verbatim, but it simply is saying that there is a process here for us to levy this fee as a land use regulation, and that it's meant to cover the costs of an existing or planned capital project. So I've already mentioned that operations and maintenance are excluded from this, and so it's the capital and infrastructure costs. And the definition of there is something just typically duration of more than 5 years, that it's going to stick around, or that it's more than $500 is, I think, is some of the regulations. But I think the town might have its own capital equipment definition. We realize that there are certain requirements per the statute. Oh, sorry, I was just going to go back there quickly, is that we need to have a plan, and that's really where we're at this point in time, the first bullet point. We're also articulating some of the standards, the level of service that the fire department expects to maintain into the future. But then later, we need a capital budget and program, which the fire department already has, but we're looking to increase or expand and add additional apparatus and equipment over time to reflect the additional demands that we forecast. Then we need to identify to the town and to future payers of the impact fees, what are they going to get out of this? What are the projects? What do they likely cost? What are the other funding sources that we're accounting for? And then lastly, a funding formula. So all of that will be accounted for in an impact fee study and an ordinance that eventually will be amended because the town already has one. So at a high level, the general methodology here is that we look at growth from the town perspective. What kind of forecasts do we have? What's the existing rate of growth that we see today? And then how does that look to occur in the future? We then have this deficiency. Are we meeting our current needs? Or do we plan to not currently satisfy the future residents at our current service standard? And then how might we mitigate this? How might we add more capacity? What is the cost of that mitigation? And then we develop a base impact fee. And then we won't go into it tonight, but there's a net fee, which basically accounts for some credits and double counting type of adjustments that would have to be done at the end of the process. So next slide, Greg, maybe 2 slides forward. This one just gives a lay of the land. Right now, we're in the phase 1 of this study, where we've been focused primarily on the existing conditions. We've been looking at the physical infrastructure that we have and how does that relate to the ability to satisfy the demand for fire protection today, as well as EMS coverage. Where we will, going after this meeting, is start to explore the future conditions. So we'll be discussing the changes in land use within the town, as well as then what is the additional infrastructure, equipment, structures that we might need. We'll also explore possible permutations here as to how will the station look to evolve. Phase 1 could be part of a station. There could be the full outside structure. We could also explore different permutations of involving Essex Rescue. So we're going to be exploring several ways that the fee could look in the future to not only keep the fire department as it is today, but also increase the range of services that could be potentially offered. So anybody can jump in if I say anything here that needs correcting. So just to move on, the rest of the steps here will just be more in the documentation side of things, the fee itself, how to design it so that it's fair, it's equitable, all land uses are treated fairly relative to their demands on the system. And then lastly, we'll go in and update complete a final study report, as well as update the town ordinance for implementing the fee. So 2 slides ahead, again, Greg, will go to a chart on demographics. This one's just simply, it's always helpful to put us into context. I don't think it's a surprise for anyone in the room here that as of 1950, Chittenden County as a whole, but particularly the Essex and Essex Junction area, we saw a dramatic increase in our population. As of the 1950s, the town rose as the share of the county. So the dotted line is the relative share of Chittenden County overall. And then the yellowish orange line is the total population for the city and the town. Now, we had to go back all the way. We pulled all the census data back to about 1790, so we included the village or the city now and the town. And it just puts it into context that we've seen dramatic increases over the last 70 years now, but it's remained relatively stable though since the 1970s that we've been seeing this linear projection of growth. And we expect that to continue, frankly, to a degree. So this chart, we want to focus on the fire department. And if we look at the second table, it's titled "The Population Over Age 65." We realize, particularly in the EMS category, is that our demands on the fire department and the EMS services are changing. We've seen that certain populations, age is one population that does require more service over time, and that the over 65 age group is increasing faster than the general population at large. And so that's additional strain on the fire department and the EMS services particularly. The tables here are just helpful for your context as well. It's just the town is sitting just over 11,000 population, getting closer to 12,000. It's averaging somewhere, the running average, and clearly the COVID pandemic and the surveying and the census data shows a big bump in 2021. I don't know how accurate that is or not, but it shows a dramatic increase in the population, 467, for instance, in 1 year. But longer term, it's kind of that 40 to 80 persons per year that the town is adding. The over 65 population is just a little shy than that, around 100 though. So. All right, now the population and housing itself, the fee is typically assessed at a household basis. So I use housing units rather than population when we're discussing these things. The housing units are on a rolling average, increasing somewhere around 70 to 80 housing units per year. Again, we expect that to probably continue for the foreseeable future, when we're about 4,800 housing units at this point in time within the town. And you can see, again, the relatively stable, even though the fluctuation in the orange shows it's a little bit accentuated, but the orange shows a relatively stable trend of growth for the last 12 years or so. Now, the next chart is busy, and I'm not going to go into the details here, but I always like to try to dial in and understand just not one data source. And for the For employment and job data, there's several data sources here, but all of them show a very similar trend line, and it's somewhere increasing about 100 jobs, 120 jobs per year that the town is currently experiencing from a rate of growth. So we're seeing population growth as well as job growth pretty clearly from the historical data for the last 12 years at least. So now let's look at what that growth has meant for the fire department itself and the demands on the services. So on the next slide.
Could I ask?
Yep, go ahead.
Some of the acronyms here.
Yes.
On the graph, could you explain what those mean?
Yeah, if I can remember all of these, they are documented in the memo that's also in your handouts. The Chittenden County Regional Planning Commissions, that's the CCRPC. They do a forecast as part of their long-range transportation plan and their long-range regional planning. The other data sets are the American Community Survey, that's the ACS data, so that's a U.S. Census product that comes out every year, but this is the 5-year rolling average data. And there is a way in the journey to work data where you can try to weed out those that are working from home. And so we try to compare various data sources. So we have both the historical ACS with total employment and those that might be working from home. And so if we exclude those that are working from home, they might already be treated in the resident population. So that's kind of the nice why we're trying to distill those two populations out. And then the historical longitudinal employment and housing dynamics data, I think, is the historical LEHD. And that is a payroll data source, not a census product. And it collects more, it's a sample set that changes year to year. You don't have as reliable longitudinal set of data. That's why you also could see in this set that the black line on the bottom that dips in the 2020, you can see that because of the pandemic, there was a reduction in the payroll within town.
Thank you.
Yep, you're welcome. So when we're returning to the call data, the first chart I'll show you here is just simply to ground us a little bit, is that our land use planning, Greg, we'll go to the next slide, our land use planning matters. All of you will understand kind of where these land uses are. We've created a heat map, that's why it's kind of this blob structure here, meant to anonymize enough of the call data to not locate specific parcels. But what I want to draw attention to is the vast residential nature of the town is really not contributing to the magnitude of call volume that we're seeing day to day. And that it is primarily focused in a couple key areas. We have the Susie Wilson Road corridor. We have in the Essex downtown now and close to the 80 and 90 Main Street, as well as some of the other homes coming off of the 289 Cirque, as well as some locations off Sand Hill. So it's where the population is more dense. That makes sense. There's more call volume. But there are also very specific land uses that we'll get to in a following table that do contribute to some of the call volume that we're seeing and that we need to just recognize, and we could design the fee in certain ways to reflect the true demands on the department. So next slide. The first data point that we want to draw attention to is the dramatic increase in medical and EMS calls. We've seen this chart goes back to 2008, and it ends, the data that we were using at this point in time was through October of 2023. And I think even through the end of the calendar year 2023, it still ended up about 60% of the total calls are EMS in nature. And that's now nearly double from 2008. So we'll go to the next slide. That puts it in context relative to the total call volume. Again, this is through the October, I think end of October 2023, where I think we ended the year somewhere 1,300 calls total, and I think those were maybe answered calls.
Answered calls,
Right.
that's correct.
So that is a distinction maybe that we should put on the title of this call, is that these are the answered calls that were responded to by the department. We've seen total call volume have increased 58% since 2008 at an annual rate of about 3.9%. Now, EMS calls have increased 170% over that same time period. Now, population has increased about 1% per year. So you contrast that to the 3.9. So the 3.9 is actually much more similar to the job growth that we've seen at about 4% per year. However, per the next chart, we'll see whether the job growth is really, it's related to the call volume itself, but we think some of the land uses themselves are more tied to the call volume demand.
I just want to add that the total calls for service for calendar year 2023 was approximately 1,700. And the ones that weren't answered, as I mentioned before, were EMS in nature. So,
All right, so we'll get into this next slide. I think, again, just draws attention to particular choices that we have as a town. And any of the villages in Chittenden County, we're seeing dramatic demand for certain types of land uses. Density matters. The commercial apartments, particularly the second row there, if we look at it in totality, it has about 10% of the total call volume. But there's only 19 parcels that are associated with that call volume. And if we look at it on the parcel basis, it's about 24 times the per parcel average across the town. So there's certain individual parcels that are associated with a dramatic or at least significant share of the total calls. The commercial land uses, which I mentioned how the job growth is more akin to the annual call volume growth, commercial land uses, again, are 6 times the average on a per parcel basis. Now, these land uses contribute a lot to the grand list. They contribute a lot to the vibrancy and the ability to house and provide job growth, but they do impact the fire department. So that's why we're trying to draw out these things and identify that at the end of the day, we can design the fee to either account for these particular types of land uses or try to reflect their demand on the department. Some other land uses there are just to call out the ones that are elevated above.
Can you tell me what a mobile home landed is and a mobile home unlanded is?
Yeah, the unlanded are those that do not own the land under the mobile home. And so
Okay.
you typically have a rental agreement or a long-term lease.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, I don't know if you already have this or if you can even split them apart, but is most of these calls for EMS, or is it hard to decipher on what's fire and what's EMS? Like, for example, the commercial apartments, imagine there's not a lot of fire calls there.
At this point in time, the call volume that I've processed does not have that granularity on the call type by the location. So if that's something that you want to explore, we can discuss that later on. But
We can provide that for
Yes.
you. The
Yeah.
call request for apartments.
Oh, right.
Right.
So you're getting a fire alarm for
That is
smoking.
increasing at the
So when a kid walking by can pull it.
So, yeah. Okay. Thank you.
all right. So moving on. Why this matters is not only the type of the land use, but then also the general categorization. In the most basic fee design, you typically have a residential and a non-residential, but that previous table shows how you can slice the residential into different categories as well as the non-residential into different categories. But at this point in time, we're seeing this kind of average breakdown. We analyzed 22 months of data to get this ratio that about 55% of the calls are associated with non-residential uses within the town, and the balance 44% residential. So eventually we can have the conversation whether we want to have any further distinction between these different categories. So just something to keep in
Sure,
mind.
I understand. The
Yep.
commercial apartments on this slide would be non-residential?
We actually put them into the residential.
Okay.
Yeah, because they are housing. They're residential in nature, even though they're typically a for-profit or some kind of entity that's a commercial landlord.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
I would offer that the breakdown would be very handy to have in the future. I think that would help get an impact fee fast.
You think with more additional details?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll take that on board. Thank you.
Yeah, because now, coming out from my last comment that I see on this, is like, if we could see non-residential, alarms, if there's 185 alarms and 3 fires, then it shows specifically to the commercial side of things that, you guys have to roll out, I'm sure, a full crew to a large building if there's an alarm, fire alarm.
Correct.
And then you get there and it's the same alarm that's been off 5 times that month, or because I was thinking medical, but I didn't think about automated alarm systems.
True. The only thing I would add to that, Ethan, is the fact that that 6th time that you go to the same building and kind of become complacent, that's when a resident actually caught something, is not in the apartment, was cooking, and now you have a fire. And then we have a very large structure that we have to have full coverage on. So it's I understand what you're saying, and I feel the frustration sometimes too when it's time after time, but you never know
Right.
when it's going to be the real one.
Okay, well, we will take away that feedback on the distinction and the data we can see then eventually. And then, as I mentioned, the development of the fee itself can take a conversation and how many different land uses, what's the right mix, what's fair, all of that could be considered. All right, so we're getting near the end and we'll take some questions. The 3 general approaches to impact fees. I want to kind of bring us back to the beginning and say, what are impact fees for? How do we implement this? These are 3 general approaches. I would say that we're not in the condition or not in the situation of a buy-in approach, which is in some fast-growing suburban communities, they pre-build a bunch of infrastructure, be it roads, maybe fire departments, and they wait for the growth to occur. And so in that way, you're buying into the facilities that you've already built. We're going to be in a situation where we're in an incremental or plan-based approach. The incremental approach, which was documented in a draft version, if you will, or even a conceptual version in the memo that was presented or provided, the incremental based approach is just a linear extrapolation of today's standards. I would argue that the department today is at an inflection point. We're seeing the demands dramatically increase for certain land uses. We're seeing the land uses themselves change within the town of Essex. We're also seeing just the nature of the EMS and the dramatic share of calls relative to the total call volume, is that just linear expansion of today's department may not cut it. And so that brings us to a plan-based approach. And this is where you look to the future and you say, what is the service that we want to provide for our community? And you kind of go out 10, 15 years, sometimes 20 years, and you say, this is what it looks like to service our community. And then you backcast and you divide the cost of meeting that additional capacity across existing residents and future residents. And so you can mix and match these approaches, this incremental and plan approach, but we'll be exploring the different approaches. For instance, you can buy new radios, you can buy new apparatus for staff, maybe on an incremental approach, but then maybe a station or a new pumper, new vehicle, you might need these stepwise big jumps in capacity. So that's why you might need a plan-based approach. So we'll be trying to reflect those as we get more clarity on the types of infrastructure and equipment that we're going to explore. So the last slide I have for you is just really where are we going? Is that we're moving to phase 2 after this meeting. We'll be discussing, looking at forecasts that have been developed by the Chittenden County Regional Planning Commission as well as here in the town about where is the town growing, geospatially, where is it growing, how much, is it residential, commercial, all of those types of questions. So we'll try to put some maps and tables together, get some agreement on that, because that's the critical piece to an impact fee is the change of the demand. And then to reflect how does the department change and evolve, we'll say what are the future assets of the department that we need to satisfy that demand. And then we'll be accounting for existing deficiencies today. The current station is partially deficient, and so we cannot fully pay for that on the back of new growth. So there will be some recognition that existing residents today have some responsibility to basically upgrade, maybe not the existing facility, but maybe something as a small portion of the new facility, is that there's the cost to replace existing capacity. That is not eligible for impact fees. And then lastly, we'll talk about the revenue that could be projected from the amount of growth that we have and ensure that the revenue is in line with the way that we can spend that money. There's some legal requirements that you have to spend the money within a certain time frame, whether we bond for things or pay for things on a cash flow basis. And then lastly, we'll be putting into a base fee and any applicable credits, and then finalize that in a study, an ordinance, and hopefully adoption. So that's where we'll go. That's where I'll end tonight. And I know it may be a little longer than we expounded to, but I think it was helpful to walk through all that. And happy to take any questions or add any supplemental material from the department members behind me.
How do you go about determining the base fee?
Well, depending on the methodology, it would be different. But as mentioned, maybe the plan-based approach. Most simply, it would be the cost of the new capacity, and you'd identify what out of that new capacity is going to satisfy new growth. It won't be, because some of that new capacity may be benefiting existing residents today. So you need to be mindful of that. But in essence, it will be the cost of the new capacity divided by, and what share of it is residential, what share of it is non-residential. And then, so let's say the residential share, you divide it by the number of housing units that you expect over a certain time period. And that would be your base fee on a per housing basis. So a single family housing might pay X amount per every housing dwelling unit.
So say these senior complexes that we have, they decide to build on.
Yep.
Are they still going to be assessed an impact fee?
Yes. Once an ordinance gets accepted, there could be a phase-in period depending on the magnitude and sometimes your ability, your interest in assessing the fee from day one, or sometimes it's a 25, 50%, 100% phase-in. But at some point, there'll be a time when any new, and the timing, I'm not clear exactly how the impact fee works today, whether it's that certificate of occupancy or whether a building permit. At some point, there is that time when a check would be expected.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
I got another question. On my first question, I was looking at the population housing graph in the lower part. What is one unit detached and attached? Is that with a garage or without?
No, it's typically would be 2-unit townhouse.
Yeah. So
Would be 1 unit but attached.
Attached to another.
Yeah.
Okay. And then to follow off what was Don saying, because I found this chart really interesting, but would the fee, and I know this is future planning, but would the fee be structured as household, or would there be separate fees for 20 more units and single household?
I would typically do it a per dwelling unit, so that if it's a 20-unit structure, they'd be paying 20 times for that residential demand.
Because I'm just thinking, like, yeah, I don't know a lot about this. I'm just thinking, but the rarity of a structure fire in a single family home and the difference in responding to a building with alarms like we were talking about earlier.
Right.
I feel that there's got to be some sort of statistic there that's 10 to 1 for an alarm. You know, I don't know. I'm just throwing a random number out there, but I would say that would be something to look into on a certain size. And I don't know what occupancy size is. Is it 5 units where you need alarms? Is it 10? You know what I mean? Does a 4-unit building need alarms in it?
Alarms?
Yeah.
Every unit, every building
Any
needs,
rental.
every multifamily needs some sort of an alarm. The
Automatic though, or just the smoke detectors?
combination CO and smoke detectors.
More than 3 units or more,
Yeah.
you would need
You'd need a commercial.
automatic
So that would be something that
square footage.
I would look into.
Occupancy, like medical or
Right.
Right.
care.
Right.
required.
Because my thought on that is if my microwave catches on fire and I have a 3-unit thing, my neighbor will come over and say, "Is everything okay?" Yeah, my microwave had burnt popcorn in it. But in a 10-unit, you guys are showing up automatically.
Right.
If it gets called in, the
If
fire
it
department,
gets
they're
called
gonna
in,
go.
if it gets called in.
It's going to be alarmed.
Okay,
Right.
so if it's a 2-unit, you know what I mean?
2 unit, it might stay
I'm just thinking of, you know, preventative. If I was at my house, my smoke detector goes off, my wife's in the kitchen waving a towel, you know, we know we're okay. We don't have to automatically signal a large response, you know, especially with a 20-unit building and you're showing up with 5 trucks and every guy you can get off volunteers basis. So I think that's where it's more of, I love it, but I just want to make sure we get our biggest bang for our buck when we go to looking at those specifics with large units and commercial buildings.
I think John has a couple of comments to add to that too.
Well, I think you're absolutely right that the nature, I didn't show the chart with the breakdown of the housing units by type, but that's part of the future growth, is that what units are going to show up in the future. Because again, like I mentioned, the department's at this inflection point where if the land uses suddenly put a bunch of 20-unit buildings in, it's going to change the nature of the response, and therefore the cost. And so we can design a fee that would reflect the nature of the demand. And so whether that's the density of the building itself, and then medical buildings, that would be a commercial land use versus the multi-unit residential. So those distinctions, I think if we can crunch the numbers and get a bit more clarity on the type of call and the response, and at the end of the day, we want to attribute the demands fairly. And that is a political conversation as much as an analytical one.
The other thing we're going to want to take a good look at too is in future growth, what's the height of the future growth? How many stories are we going up? Because if we go above what we're doing now, that's going to create different equipment demands for us. So again, that's, as we looked to the future, that's why we said, you know what, let's see if an impact fee would work. Let's see if the voters would vote it in, and maybe spread a little bit of the future costs for future development over, take some of the burden away from the current taxpayers. So
So to lean in a little bit on the conversation around medical versus residential, would an assisted living facility or a senior living facility, would that qualify as medical or residential?
I think we called it a commercial apartment.
Okay.
And I'll look at the grand list. I was using the grand list land use definitions. There was one unit that we noted, and we specifically changed it to commercial apartment to reflect the occupants that are there. But that is a distinction that we'll make sure that we have a clarity on.
I heard medical and it just,
Right.
clarification is important.
Greg, I think Ken might have had a question. I thought
Kendall?
Kendall.
Yeah, I would just note that I grew up watching Emergency, so I think it's coming back around where it's going to be very important that the fire has the capacity to handle the EMS calls they get. So I'm glad that you were looking at that in your report. I was also curious, I'm sure that Essex has had an ISO study done. Are we very deficient as far as that goes?
We are due for another review. We are due for another review, I believe in 2 years, but our current ISO rating is a 5 and 9. And 9 because of our rural, we're not on hydrants. The ISO rating that we had, that most of us grew up knowing, has changed in the last 10 years. So it's not based on the same set of circumstances as it was. But yes, fire equipment, infrastructure, highways, things like that do impact the ISO rating.
Will this study be able to address some of those possible needs?
We'll have to look at the demand and how the system responds, because that's what we're going to be looking at, where all the demand arrives from or is derived from, and then I'm relying on Chief Cole and others to identify what are the apparatus, what's the type of response that we need.
Great, thank you.
As a general statement, I appreciate all your comments because I am learning all of this as this process is going through. This is nothing I've ever experienced at any time in my career, so I very much welcome all of your comments and ideas to make this a more comprehensive and complete study. So thank you.
All right, any other
Okay.
questions?
I was actually going to
Comments?
make one more comment. Once the study is done, about what is the outlook for years wise? Is it 10-year, 20-year study?
It does come down to some of it can be, as I mentioned, the incremental. So it will just hold while the costs and the system, it will be kind of up to the town and the fire department to know whether the assets that are in the study are still relevant. If it's a plan-based, it will be at least a 10-year horizon, but it comes down to a little bit of when anybody finances things, right? If you push it out over more years, it might be cheaper in year one. And so there's some aspect of that. So it comes down to a political number sometimes. How much do we think we can allocate fairly onto new residential and new commercial land use? But the bottom line is that as long as the capital items remain relevant, then the fee should remain relevant. So that's what will be guiding that year.
Okay, perfect. I just made that comment because we have an 8-year town plan, and if the report kind of tied into that, it would help the town with its planning.
Yeah, impact fees are typically on a kind of their own trajectory, their own schedule. But bottom line is, as long as the growth remains relative to what's being experienced and the capital response remains consistent with what the department thinks they need, then that's when it becomes it can continue indefinitely, basically, if those things hold true.
Thank you.
All right, any other comments or questions? Any questions or comments from the public?
Hand up in the room.
All right, Ken, come on up.
Hi, I have a question about the population chart. Would you bring that up, please?
In the table or the chart?
Yeah, the table. Oh, sorry. I thought somebody was bringing it up on the screen.
I'm working on it.
Yeah.
He's working on it. Okay, great. Well, I just wanted to point out that I just checked the U.S. Census numbers for 2020, which are complete. And these numbers, the number for 2020 is off by about 580 according to the U.S. Census. So I just would like to see that these numbers get double checked against the U.S. Census. I also double checked the 2021 estimate, which is there as well on the U.S. Census site. And this is off by a lot there as well. Most importantly is the growth rate, of course. And there's a projection here between 2020 and 2021 of 487. I believe that's right.
467.
Sorry, I can't quite see.
Yep.
467.
Yep.
And it seems to be a bit lower with the U.S. Census numbers. So I think it's important to double check those.
Yeah, absolutely. These were derived from the ACS data rather than the census data. So
What is the ACS?
The American Community Survey, using the 5-year rolling average. So there is a distinction between the decennial census data and the I don't know what data
Which do
source
you
you
think
used.
is more accurate?
The 2020 census is good, but we're trying to show this trend over time. And so the ACS gives a lot of the interim data points. No population estimate is 100% accurate, so I like to go with trends rather than a precise number on any point, but I will go and confirm those sources.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, thanks, Ken. All right, thanks so much, John, and thanks for the fire department staff who came to support this.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
All right,
Thank you.
great.
Thank you guys for all your hard work too. Appreciate it.
Thanks for coming back.
Yeah, hey. We heard the
That was one of those high occupancy building alerts.
All right, so let's move on to our next business item, 5C, discussion and future development plans for 80 and 90 Upper Main Street. Greg, who's going to cover that?
I can touch on that, and Catherine.
Greg, yes,
Sonic-
because nobody else is
Catherine
here on the
Sonic is
list.
here as well. She's online. So really just a check-in, an update on some of the conversations we've had in the past. We have issued an RFP for a consultant to help us start doing the design work and the public engagement work around what we want to see on that property. I'm going to let Catherine speak to that if there's questions, and also We gathered some information from V-Trans and can take a look at our parks ordinances a little bit more closely so we can speak to the question about how to access the site and potential for recreation on the site. But figure we can start with the RFP and turn it over to Catherine unless you want to take a different approach.
Fine.
Go ahead, Catherine.
Hi. So the RFP for the site planning services was sent out on Friday a couple weeks ago, and we're expecting to have responses back by the 23rd of this month. And if you remember the site planning, we decided to wrap into some of the more short-term sort of interim planning for the site that was brought up recently when we were talking about community gardens and trail access. So far I've had a couple firms who have expressed some interest, but not much else yet. So understandable since it hasn't been issued for that long yet.
All right, great. Thanks, Catherine.
May, Andy, just
Yeah,
to
go
speak
ahead,
about
Craig.
the timeline of the RFP. So as Catherine mentioned, the deadline is later on this month. We hope to have a firm selected by April, and then really spend the spring and the summer getting into doing the public engagement, getting some of that feedback, working on the potential designs and concepts for that site. We're hoping to wrap up by the fall, November, December timeframe, to give the select board enough time and the public enough time if there's a need and desire to go forward with any sort of vote, potentially a bond vote for next town meeting. So we're not presuming that, but we did want to leave enough time in case that becomes an option.
All right, any questions or comments, board members?
I have one question. I know in one of the original designs, there was possible access off Stage Road. Is that something that could be done quicker or easier than an access off of Route 15? Just curious.
So I would say possibly that, but the problem really with that access point is it would be pretty close to the Route 15 intersection. And so it would probably only be, better to be, I should say, one way in as opposed to in and out. So it's not really probably a good spot for a permanent in and out access, or even temporary, I should say.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thanks, Kendall. Any other questions or comments?
I was just curious about the wording there for the park being closed from 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. and I was looking, or 10 p.m. was it? I was just looking for some clarification on the ordinance and if it must be signed with hours of operation and trespassing in accordance with state statute in order for that to be legal and effective.
Where are you, Ethan?
It's in the memo. It goes on to talk about the town's current ordinances for public land.
Oh, that.
And I looked up the state statute, and I'm not saying I know the answer to this question. I'm simply asking the question, but there is a discrepancy there about hours of operation and trespassing signs to be posted in accordance with state statutes. So I didn't know if you had to have those things in order to enforce those rules.
I don't believe so. My interpretation of the ordinance, and I'm happy to give it another look, but my interpretation was that the parks are open from 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. Unless there's that permit. And I think the signage would go up to just clarify that and make sure the public is aware of that more clearly if somebody's pulling into the site. But that my interpretation of the ordinance is that those are the hours.
Okay. Because I just peeked over at the state statute earlier today, and it goes on to say about enforcement of controlled property they listed, and without hours of operation and what's the other word I'm looking at? Not posted signs, but the other one.
No trust.
Yeah, no, without hours of operation and trespassing signs, those hours are actually not enforceable per state statute. because it's just open land. Just like being a private landowner, you'd have to have proper signage in accordance with state statute. But I don't know if there's a sub statute in the state statute that says municipalities are exempt from proper signage via Vermont state statute. But I know that's how it works as a private landowner. So I just didn't know if there's a hole
So
there.
the memo does say staff will work to install signage at 80 and 90 Upper Main Street to satisfy whatever those requirements are. It says that right in the memo.
Right.
Yeah, Ethan, if you want to send me that.
Yeah, I
that
can.
would
I
help,
just
and
saw it
can
earlier,
get
and I saw it was
clarity
on the
whether,
memo,
the
so.
signs that I have in mind would be sufficient, or if we would need to post the whole perimeter or not.
Yeah, I think it's more of a question of all of the, so I can send that over. But when I was reading through the memo, I just figured it'd be a good time to spark that.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, anybody else?
Catherine,
Any
what
comment?
happens if you don't find somebody, you don't like the bid suggestions or the,
I don't anticipate that.
okay.
I would say, yeah, I don't know. I think we'd probably have to regroup and think if we would need to make some changes. Probably would reach out to some firms and ask why they didn't bid. You know, I think we have a pretty aggressive timeline that could be an issue I could see. But yeah, otherwise, I think we'd have to just ask and see what we need to change in order to get somebody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, anybody else? Any comments or questions from the public?
There are no hands in the room.
Okay.
Well, no hands raised in the room.
All right, so thank you for that discussion. Greg, was there anything else in that?
No, that was really just informational. Glad to hear the feedback, and Ethan, let's touch base. I can try to get you more information on that signage piece. But no, nothing else. Thank you.
All right, great. So last business item will be executive session discussion. Greg, did you have anything you wanted to talk to us about? Or is this is us talking about your evaluation?
It's that. So
Okay, all right.
probably go in to get you set up, and then I'll step out unless you call me back in.
Okay. So all of the inputs that we've asked for from department heads and also all of the select board members have completed their own surveys with regard to Greg's performance in the past year. And so we'll be having a executive session discussion about that later. All right, so moving on to consent.
Make the motion we approve the consent agenda.
All right, thank you. Ethan, is there a second?
If there's a second, can we discuss something in it after?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
And I'll second it for the purpose of discussion.
All right, thank you, Don. Is there any discussion? Don?
My issue is with the school department mailing the ballots, even though they're paying for it, given the fact that we are soon to be facing a huge increase in school taxes, and I think they should be saving their pennies. I'm not going to oppose it, but I just think that it's not a good idea at this time when it's so easy to request a ballot. So, my comment.
All right.
Can I ask
Thanks,
a
Don.
follow-up question on that?
Yes.
In the memo, it does say we respect the significant effort that mailing ballots presents for our town clerks and city staff. Is covering the cost of mailing ballots to all active registered voters, does that only cover the cost of the mailing, or does that include staff time to prepare checklists, accuracy of checklists, so on and so forth?
I think when you get to that level of detail, it's a good question. That most of the work that we foresee happening and that the clerk's office foresees happening is through this JET service, which we've used in the past. As far as verifying checklists, verifying voters, that's something the clerk's office does throughout the year, so it's tough to really separate it and say it's just for this issue. I guess I would argue that's probably a function of the clerk's office. They're doing that anyways. It's not as if they're doing additional work to get ready for this mailing, for this election. That's really going to be the jet service will be doing that prep work and that mailing.
Okay.
I don't know, does that answer your question?
It does, but also when the ballots are returned, like collating them, checking them off, doing all of that work as well.
I believe that's the jet service, but I
It
can
is.
find. I
Okay.
believe it's not.
No.
That's your BCA.
I asked that question last year, and it was just the mailing. 'Cause last year it was a discussion topic. It wasn't the consent. I don't know. But Andy had told us like every year that we don't have any control over what they do, just how it affects us.
I have one more question after seeing our wonderful firemen are still here. What is car 10?
That is our that's our Tahoe that we have out here now. It was used as an EMS vehicle up until we got the squad.
Okay.
Now it's our command vehicle.
Okay. And then it's time because of the age we're replacing it.
Yes.
It wasn't unexpected. Okay. I thought that's what it was, and I go, I can't remember which one. Okay, thank you. I'm good.
It's lived in Vermont for
Oh, I
quite a
know.
while.
Salt, I know. I have no
All
further
right.
questions, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, all right. Anybody else?
Yes, I have a few. I would just note that on the road that I don't believe that the state fee covers all the additional costs, and that those should be borne by the developer through the warranty period. And it kind of smacks to me of public work on private property. Because I looked at the information that was provided, and there is nothing in there that says the developer should pay or reimburse the town for the actual cost of the maintenance of the road. So I just wanted to note that. I did want to note that with the Clean Water Fund, it's the loan there, you could have paid that off by increasing a user fee specifically by $10 a year because it was only a $50 charge. I was wondering if staff might want to look at doing something like Green Mountain Power does with the water and sewer bills, where if you have a smaller loan like that, instead of putting all the effort into going through the loan working, just putting a note on the bills for a specific fee for a specific use, just a note. As far as the truck and the fire department, I'm just curious if the town of Essex ever looks at the state bids that go out there, and if there's any opportunity to piggyback onto that to get what we need. And thank you for mentioning the school ballots. I thought that the school should do what the town did, which was offer anybody who needed a ballot and just cover that. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Kendall. Any other discussion? Okay, all those in favor of approving consent, please say aye.
Hi.
Aye. Opposed, say nay.
Nay.
Okay, since we have remote attendees, we need to do a roll call vote. Don, what is your vote?
Aye.
Ethan, what is your vote?
Aye.
Tracy, what is your vote?
Aye.
My vote is aye. And Kendall, what is your vote?
Nay.
Okay, consent is approved 4-1. Let's move on to the reading file. Any board member comments?
I'd like to thank Dan for that explanation. I'm still confused. I guess there's really no easy explanation for me to understand. I appreciate his time though, and
We're happy to try to sit down with you and talk with you. I had questions and worked with them too. It's not a.
it's in, it's out, and I got lost like halfway. I go, okay, I think I understand how it happened, but
it's tough, and you
Yeah.
did a good job explaining it
Yeah.
in the memo. Sometimes it takes that conversation, so happy to try to set that up.
just tell him I appreciate it. It's just thanks.
I just had one quick comment about the Public Works winter update. I was just curious, and it looks really good this year. I'm thankful, even though with the amount of ice we've had. But I'm just curious if, in the future we should be adding in road gravel, because unprecedented winters like this year, we've used more road gravel than I think we have sand. But Just didn't know if that's a number that we should start comparing now that winter's changing so much and it's falling in a winter's work scope and not spring.
Sure, happy to talk to Public Works and see if that's something
sure
that
it's not
they track and
significant.
can provide.
Yeah.
Mhm.
But I'm happy to see the usage. Hopefully it warms up.
We're in the spring of deception, like number 3.
I know.
At this point.
All right, anybody else?
Yes, I have a few comments here as well. Sorry.
Go ahead, Kendall.
As far as the note on the sidewalk, I just want to point out that some of the places that have an ordinance that require residents to maintain the sidewalks are very unpopular. Generally, a lot of the towns, they maintain all their sidewalks because they consider it a cost of service. And to meet your equity, that's what you need to do, is maintain all of your public facilities. As far as the payment settling up with the city, I just wanted to note that I don't think that the town should do that until the tax delinquencies are addressed. And in relation to that, I think that a future agenda item should possibly be looking at our tax sale and update policy, especially since the result from the audit. And I just wanted to note that that stormwater permit has a lot of things in there, a lot of new costs that are going to be coming up. So, thank you.
All right, thanks, Kendall. Anybody else? Okay, then let's, we need motions for executive session. Or a motion, I guess it is, right? Or is it motions?
Just one, I believe.
I move that the select board enter into executive session to discuss the appointment or employment or evaluation of a public officer or employee in accordance with 1 VSA Section 313A3 to include the town manager.
Second.
Thank you, Tracy. Thank you, Ethan. Any further discussion? We will not be coming back to make any motions after this, so we'll not be returning. Well, we'll just adjourn from executive session, or once we close executive session. Okay, all those in favor of going into an executive session, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, say
Aye.
nay. Okay, motion passes 5-0. So thank you for all those who attended, and correct.